The Quarterly, the Book of Isaiah, Lesson 6, Isaiah 27, in days to come. In Proverbs 13:12, we're told that hope deferred makes the heart sick. If that's true, Isaiah 27 is good medicine for the sick heart, encouraging faith in a world where hope seems to be long deferred. The theme is obvious from the repeated refrain, in that day, verse 1, in that day, verse 2, in days to come, verse 6, in that day, verse 12, in that day, verse 13. We begin with words of judgment upon the nations that are arrayed against God's people, who are represented by the sea monster Leviathan, verse 1. And that's followed by an oracle of hope for Judah in verses 2 to 5. Then there's an oracle of judgment against Judah in verses 7 through 11, and words of hope for those who are exiled amongst the nations in verses 12 to 13. In the center, marked out by the variant refrain, in days to come, is the primary message of the passage. The time will come when Israel, like a well-tended vine, will take root and bud and blossom, filling the world with its fruit. Verse 6. Her sins will be forgiven, her guilt atoned for, she will receive a new heart, and will be at peace with her God. The mythical sea monster Leviathan shows up in a number of biblical passages. It does not refer to a literal animal, such as a crocodile or a hippopotamus, but rather it represents the forces of darkness that are arrayed against God's people, whether in the form of the nations or the satanic forces that operate behind them. In Job 41, Leviathan appears as what we might call the beast from the sea, if you think about Revelation 13:1, operating in tandem with Behemoth, the terrifying beast from the land. Like Behemoth, Leviathan has similarities to real-world animals, in this case a crocodile. He has armor-plated skin with row upon row of scales and a terrifying pair of jaws that are loaded with teeth. Job 41:14 to 17. Yet like Behemoth, he is no ordinary animal. He lives in the depths of the sea, and he can breathe fire like a dragon, verses 19 to 21. In Psalm 74, Leviathan is classed with the great sea monsters. He is the seven-headed icon of evil, a fearsome representative of the dark powers of this world. Yet in each of the passages where Leviathan appears, the point that is being made is that the Lord has far greater power than he does. In the book of Job, the Lord can play with Leviathan like a pet parakeet, or put him on a leash like a young puppy. Job 41:5. Here in Isaiah, he pierces his armor easily with his sword. The threefold description of God's sword, hard and great and strong, Isaiah 27:1, matches the threefold description of the serpent, the fleeing, twisting serpent, which is the dragon in the sea. The resemblance to the iconic anti-trinity of the book of Revelation, the beast from the sea, the beast from the land, and the dragon in Revelation 13, is hardly coincidental. God is going to bring this icon of ultimate evil to an ultimate end. Yet judgment upon evil is only the beginning of God's grand master plan. When the time is ripe, there will also be restoration for the Lord's chosen vineyard. The prophet has sung about the Lord's vineyard before, back in chapter 5. There the Lord prepared, protected, and cared diligently for a vineyard. But all it ever produced was sour and bitter grapes. As a result, the Lord tore down its wall of protection and left it wide open to the assaults of his enemies. Chapter 5, verses 5 and 6. But now the situation of the vineyard is reversed. It's a fruitful rather than fruitless vineyard. It will receive rain in place of drought, and the vineyard that had been abandoned now becomes a guarded vineyard. The vineyard that was overrun with thorns and briars becomes a place that is free from thorns and briars. Whereas the Lord abandoned the earlier vineyard out of frustration, he will guard and keep the new vineyard. He will watch over it continually, night and day, verse 3. And he will water it thoroughly. In fact, so great is the Lord's care for his vineyard that he almost wishes for an infestation of thorns and briars to appear, so that he could obliterate them afresh with all of the thoroughness of a military campaign. But the fiery fate of the cursed thorns and briars does not have to be the fate of his own people. They are invited to submit to his protection and to enter his peace. Indeed, the Lord declares that at the appropriate time in days to come, this positive future will be Israel's destiny. No longer will they be uprooted like thorns and briars, but planted, deeply rooted, like a vine in the well-loved vineyard, blossoming and putting out shoots. The result of this status will not only be blessing for Israel, but blessing for the whole world, in line with God's promise to the patriarch Abraham. See Genesis 12, 1-3. Though the Lord had plans to judge his people for their sin, nonetheless, he would deal more graciously with Israel than he did with those who oppressed them. The answer to the rhetorical question, has he struck them as he struck those who struck them, is clearly no. Even though they were acting as the instruments of his judgment, God fatally struck those other nations, especially Assyria and Babylon. But though Israel was to be judged for their sins, considering the plant metaphor, they would be withered as if by a hot east wind, verse 8. They would subsequently be restored to their land. Nor would they return from their exile unchanged. They would be transformed by the experience. Their sin would be atoned for. This is in line with the expectation in the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel of the gift of a new heart and a new spirit from God. Jeremiah 31:33, Ezekiel 36:26. The evidence of their new nature would be seen when their old idol altars to Baal would be ground into dust, while the sacred Asherah poles would be cut down, along with the small altars beside them, where incense had been offered to the Canaanite goddess. Verse 9. What's more, the fortified city of this world will be destroyed and remain desolate forever. The people without discernment, that is, Isaiah's own generation, who had turned their backs on God and would not listen to his words, would go with them, like dry kindling, into the fire. Verses 10-11. Yet the future holds out a brighter hope, that one day a harvest of God's people would be gathered from their various places of exile, from Assyria in the east and from Egypt in the west, and the grain would be threshed. Verse 12. They'll be returned to the original boundaries of the promised land, and the wheat will be separated from the chaff, the grain by grain. The loud trumpet announcing the promised year of Jubilee will finally sound. Verse 13. Summoning the exiles to come home to worship at the holy mountain in Jerusalem, as anticipated in Isaiah 2. The goal of bringing blessing to all nations of the earth would in this way be accomplished through a transformation of Israel from a nation of stubborn rebels to an obedient lawkeeper whose life and worship constantly pointed people to God. As the post-exilic books of Ezra and Nehemiah and Esther and Haggai and Zechariah and Malachi make clear, this promise was only partially fulfilled in the aftermath of the exile. God faithfully brought his people home, but they had not yet been utterly transformed by the experience of exile. The new Israel was still made up of basically the same sin as it always had been. If the promises of God were fully to be fulfilled, God himself would have to provide a new Israel in the person of Jesus, with a faithful heart, to keep the law in all of its stringency. and with the ability to make a genuine atonement for sin at the cross. This is how God would finally bring into effect his promise of a new heart for his people. For if anyone is in Christ, he or she is a new creation. 2 Corinthians 5:17. Application questions. Why do you think Isaiah uses the mythic language of Leviathan to describe the Lord's ultimate victory over the forces of evil? 2. How does the image of the vineyard connect with Israel and with Jesus? 3. How does this imagery connect with us as Christians? 4. What does the imagery of harvest in verses 12 to 13 add to the picture?